The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Greetings and welcome to the June chapter meeting of CSINext. This is our last program for the fiscal year. I'm Daniel Hargreaves, the CSINext chapter treasurer. Before we begin the presentation, I'd like to open up with a brief intro of chapter business. As we wrap up our year, you can be assured that we'll resume in September. Enjoy your summer. Hope to see you at the CSI show in August. Yep, that pretty much concludes our chapter business. But if you're not a CSINext chapter member, we'd like to have you join us. Besides the occasional meeting notification, you'll receive the monthly e-blast with program information, chapter events, meetings, program, and more. With that, let us begin our presentation, Adopting Lean Principles, Methodologies, and Practices in the Construction Industry. Observation on Challenges, Consideration, and Possible Approaches, presented by Alex Johnson with Newforma. If you have any questions, please type them in the little question box, and we'll answer them along the way. At the end of the presentation, there will be a survey. If you'd like to receive learning units, please fill out the survey. If you need AIA credit, please include your AIA number. Now I'd like to introduce our speaker. Alex Johnson holds the position of Business Solutions Consultant in the sales organization at Newforma and is charged with ensuring that sales prospects understand the value that Newforma solutions bring to critical business issues in their respective environments. In this role, Alex is responsible for delving into discovery calls and recommending and demonstrating which Newforma products are appropriate for our prospect. Whether they be architects, engineers, contractors, or owners, prior to his position at Business Solution Consultant, Alex was promoted to Inside Sales Representative from his position as Business Development Representative. Alex joined Newforma in April of 2013 after spending a year with Vista Volunteer in America program. Alex holds a BA degree in both Classic and History from the University of New Hampshire. Alex?
Thanks, Daniel. Hi, everybody. Alex Johnson here. I like to try to keep, it's me presenting, but I do like to keep these things as conversational as possible. So if you have any questions, just absolutely type them right into the chat, and Daniel will let me know that there's a question, and we'll answer it. But I kind of figured after talking with Randy about this, he had said that most of you folks in the group are fairly up on, on the cutting edge in terms of lean and lean methodologies and adopting lean in the industry. And we kind of talked about it and sort of landed on the idea of, I get exposed in my role to lots of different companies who are in various stages of adopting lean and adopting it in different ways. And I hear all sorts of different challenges and whatnot. And so we kind of figured that maybe just a little bit of an overview from a knowledge sharing perspective of, hey, here's what, here's just the challenges we see in the industry and what some people are doing about them and that sort of thing might be useful. So that's sort of the gist of what I'm going to be covering today. And yeah, like I said, if you've got questions or anything like that, please don't hesitate to speak right up. All right. So with that, we'll go right in. So it's pretty simple. I'm just going to talk about some of the challenges we face, then some of the approaches that I've seen people trying, and like Q&A, like I said, throughout the talk. So what I've found is that there's really sort of two different categories of challenges that folks are facing, right? And this is kind of a little bit of the way that I see the world. So it might not, exactly fit everybody's particular worldview, but the way that I kind of divide things up are that the challenges fall into either sort of the emotional, cultural challenges of adopting a new system or methodology or anything like that, and those to me really fall under the category of, why are we doing this? Why should we be doing this? Should we be doing this at all? What are we doing now? Why do we want to change? Is this type of change a good thing? And it's all sort of figuring out, if we should be doing this. And then once you get to the point where you say, okay, we're kind of on the same page that, yeah, this is something we want to do, well, now there's a whole set of challenges from an organizational perspective around, okay, how do we actually execute on this? How do we bring in this new system or process or set of principles and apply them to the business, and in what ways? And there's just a whole set of complexities that go along with that, and each moving piece of the organization adds another layer of complexity there. So that's kind of the two broad groups that I see things falling into, and the sort of why the cultural change questions. That's not really sort of the focus of this particular talk, but it definitely is in terms of adopting something like Lean. You have to be on the same page. There is what I've seen, just in the sense that we've talked with plenty of folks who if you talk to one person in the organization, they'll be right there on board. They'll say, yep, this is a great thing. There's all sorts of reasons why we'd want to do this. And then you talk to another person in the organization, and they're sitting there going, well, and I can see from a very high level the benefits of doing something like this, but are we sure that this is what we want to do? And it's not everyone's on the same page. And when that type of thing happens, almost inevitably, the discussions we have with folks are they sort of start. Excuse me, my allergies are acting up a little bit. The conversation starts, it tends to start in more of the organizational challenges of, oh, we're adopting Lean, or whatever sort of general starting place that conversation might have. And then it turns out that, oh, it's not actually an organizational challenge. You're still really on the cultural set of challenges of is this something we should be doing? So that's sort of one of the, I'm not going to focus on it, but definitely, we've seen that pop up, a few times here and there. So, like I was saying, the focus of this conversation is going to be the organizational challenges. They all fall into okay, now that we've agreed as a group that this is something we want to do, and we're going to do it, the question is, how do we execute? And there's a whole bunch of different considerations that really come into play here, and there's some overlap between them. And I tried to sort of break them out into what I have sort of encountered as the sort of the key theme of each challenge. But there's definitely some overlap as far as all this goes. And these are the challenges that we're going to look at in a little bit more depth today. And I kind of tried to put them in in some semblance of an order in terms of, if you're approaching this type of organizational change, what would sort of make sense to think about first, as opposed to how do you follow up on it. So in terms of the first consideration that we've really seen, it's one of the biggest ones, and it's what kind of change are you trying to drive in the organization, right? And a lot of we're a software company, right? And so typically we get involved in a conversation where people are, to one degree or another, right, considering some sort of bringing on some sort of software. And typically that's they're far enough along in the process of adopting some sort of Lean methodology that it's on the surface it seems like okay, we're doing this Lean thing, there's Lean softwares out there, how can we make this more efficient? But oftentimes when we dig into the actual change that people are trying to drive, there's a whole set of layers, right? And I don't know how familiar you folks are specifically with last planner. There's like the lean principles, right, of adding value by removing waste and respecting the people you work with in a very general sense. And there's lots of ways that you can be lean in how you do things. And then you sort of, as it applies to the construction industry, one of the specific methodologies that is starting to really grow is the last planner system, and that's a very specific application of lean to certain aspects of our industry, and that's the idea of saying, all right, so if rather than somebody from on high dictating here's how the schedule is going to work, it's flipping that on its head and saying, okay, we've got a crew on site this week doing who needs to get XYZ work done. How are they let's ask them how they're going to best do this, and they can coordinate with the other people that they need to, and it backs into the schedule in that sense. And then on top of that, you have all the different types of softwares out there. So it's very much one of the things we've seen, right, is that as people are adopting these types of changes, they very much get, there's, at least in my experience, there's not a lot of distinction between the idea of adopting lean principles versus specific methodologies versus putting a software in there. It's and I don't think that that's at least from what I've seen, confusing the three or blurring the lines between those, I think makes it more difficult in making this type of organizational change. And it's obviously every situation is different and not, but one of the things that we find and we encounter quite often is that people have this idea of, okay, so we just as an example, so we'll talk to someone and they'll say, yeah, we're implementing last planner in such and such ways, and as we're doing this, we thought, why not grab a software and make it even better? And the sort of assumption, the underlying assumption there is that if lean is good in general and last planner is a great specific application, then software must be even just accelerate those changes. And really, there's a catch where lean as an idea is very, very different in practice than a specific methodology with all sorts of workflows that are involved with it. And then you take what is essentially a set of people issues, right, in terms of how are we working together, and you throw a software into the mix, and oftentimes where software is useful is going to be in aggregating data or in some sort of reporting functionality or giving more people visibility into the status of work or be. But typically, software is not the type of thing where if you've got a people problem, you can fix it with a software solution, right? It's that typically doesn't work well. But it's sort of the type of, it's kind of the underlying assumption that we bump into more often than not. So there's a whole lot of considerations to be looking at when you're thinking about the kind of change that goes on here. But I think at least from what I've seen and the conversations I've had, the more you differentiate between the idea of adopting lean principles and becoming more lean versus putting a specific methodology in place versus using some sort of software to accelerate or drive pieces of that process, that as you sort of go down that list, the applications become more targeted, more specific, and I think people will be better served, using discretion, right? In terms of, okay, we're going to apply this particular thing to this particular aspect of the business, as opposed to just sort of lumping it all together and having a, whoopee, we're adopting lean approach. Does that, I don't want to, I hate sort of just talking at people forever. Are there questions at this point, thoughts? People bumped into this type of thing themselves? What are you folks thinking?
No one's raised their hand, but I thought you made an interesting comment there, Alex. Software doesn't solve people problems, and I think that is one of those things that gets lost. We get so engrossed in our social media and social aspects and software that people interaction is a good thing. And you're right, it doesn't solve the people problems. But no questions yet.
All right. So let's move on to the next one here. What type of change are you gonna put in place is another one that it wasn't actually something that we, Newforma's been involved in sort of the lean space for less than a year at this point, sort of coming up on it in the next few months. And going into this space, this was not one of the things that I think anyone particularly expected to be a challenge or even a thing. And so what I mean by, are you putting in place an incremental change versus a truly, revolutionary change? I think a lot of people in our industry, right, are very, very used to a spreadsheet derived view of the world, right? And if you think of whether it's using spreadsheets and logs, whether those are just Excel or some sort of software for tracking things like submittals, as you go through a project, whether it's the master schedule and you're using something like P6 or Microsoft Project, and it's all under that sort of CPM, critical path methodology there of having, it's very much a to one degree or another, people are comfortable with spreadsheets, right? And when adopting lean, one of the things that we found is that there's very much a fundamental, not quite disconnect, but not too far off either, between, people will say, for example, if you think about like a set of milestones, right, that you would see in a CPM schedule, right? And it's, you have framing, drywalling, and painting, and so on and so forth, right? And if each of those takes a set amount of time, and I'm just pulling numbers out of the air here, but if we've got 4 milestones that are dependent on one another, and we've got a week to complete each milestone, that's a month's worth of time. And if one of those milestones gets bumped out, delayed by a week because of there was someone got sick on the job, or weather related concerns, or material didn't show up, or there's tons of things that can go wrong, right? And people look at having sort of that view of the world and then switching to something lean or switch, putting a last planner methodology in place, and that idea of breaking work up into very small units of work, and instead of saying, okay, we're going to have one trade go through this entire floor, you break that floor up into 4 sections. You've got 4 trades following each other with 1 day at a time, and just having the ability to, initially save a whole bunch of time on the schedule, but you wind up with a buffer at that point, and then if something does go out, it's there's the potential to say, oh, okay, well, we can't today, but there's this other work in this other area that we could get done, and even though a particular small piece of work might not have gotten, it gets delayed by a day, the overall schedule doesn't necessarily move, or it doesn't move that much. And so, from what we've seen from the discussions we've had, people are sort of all on the same page that yes, the ability to deal with problems as they arise or variations in the schedule and not have them affect the master schedule of the project in an overly significant way. Yeah, everyone's on the same page that, right, that's great. Why wouldn't you want that type of ability? But when you say, okay, well, part of implementing that, or getting to a point where that's the way you're executing in terms of managing your projects, involves actually sort of a shift in thinking, right, and how you're approaching the work from a process standpoint. People we've found generally can say, as a group or an organization, okay, fair enough, we've got to change the way that we're approaching the planning of this work, but then it's the how are we going to track it, and how are we going to record what we've planned. And what we've seen is that people sort of default to and it's not all the time, but in the absence of anything else, people tend to default to a somewhat of a spreadsheet derived method of managing or tracking it or recording it or distributing it to various folks. And what happens is that, and whether that's a spreadsheet or it's a software that has those dependencies built in, what we find is that you start running into a lot of problems because of the way there's dissonance there, right? In the sense that the way you're thinking about and approaching the work is different than the way you're tracking it. And as soon as that happens, you've got a problem. And it's not something that we've only had a few conversations with people who are, I think, considering this up front. I think this tends to, because it's not an obvious challenge, and it certainly wasn't to us. It's taken months for us to figure out that this is potentially one of the underlying issues that people are dealing with, because it manifests itself in a ton of different ways, right? It's we're having trouble tracking what's going on with our, I'm just going to use the word spreadsheet, but whatever spreadsheet derived tool that you're using, and we've had people tell us, one group of people is tracking tracking things this way, and they look at the spreadsheet and it makes sense to them, and they've planned it with the new mindset, but they're tracking it with the spreadsheet. And then somebody else looks at the spreadsheet, whether it's management or a different stakeholder or a client or whoever it might be. They look at the spreadsheet on any given day, and they can't tell what the heck is going on, and so people will then sort of, on top of that, to address this new challenge that has grown out of the sort of spreadsheet derived view of the world, people will then spend extra time dealing with that challenge, right? And saying, okay, well, let's have someone put together a report that we're then going to send out on a weekly basis, and it goes, it sort of snowballs, right? And at a certain point, essentially people are spending time and energy dealing with sort of self-created problems, if you will. And it's interesting. And I think part of the reason that this happens is that there aren't particularly a lot of options out there that have, in terms of actually recording and managing the information and the plans that people are putting together and all that. I'm not particularly sure that there's a ton of different tools out there that actually sort of fundamentally approach it in a different way. And so we try to do that, certainly. And the big thing that we do is that we decouple the time-based view of the world from the status-based view of the plan. And so what I mean by that is that we have in our software, we've got two different views. One is time-based, and it looks essentially like a calendar, and it looks and feels very much what you would sort of think of in a coming out of a CPM tool, right? It's you've got tasks up there. Each task has a duration, and you're looking at things along left to right along the calendar, and that's useful in terms of having that overall view of what should be happening. But then we have a completely separate view where each task is actually placed in a different status. And so each column has nothing to do with the calendar. It's just simply, at least in our tool, left to right goes from needing to be planned to in progress to completed, and they're completely decoupled, right? You can change the projected duration of a task without changing its status, and vice versa. And it seems like that type of thing, right, seems like it's a very almost superficial, right? In some ways, you look at that and you say, okay, interesting. But it actually, at least from what we've seen, it tends to address, at least in one way, that issue of, looking at the status of work, and which is, when you're adopting lean, it's all about tracking workflow and what's the status of something and how are we planning based on status. And if one thing gets blocked over here, let's change the status of something else without necessarily having it automatically change the planned duration of tasks or the duration of the schedule. That decoupling of time from status is something that we found really, at least in one way, it deals with this sort of challenge at a fundamental level. But from an organizational perspective, right, everybody's very, very comfortable with spreadsheets and not at all used to decoupling these things, right? And so the question really then becomes, okay, even if you're sitting there saying, right, this makes a lot of sense, we should potentially be looking at doing something like this. How do we get the group, to go from, well, a spreadsheet's what I'm comfortable with, to stepping outside of their comfort zone? So that's even an additional challenge there, and it's the whole thing is just incredibly complex, right? And this is just at a very abstract level here that we're discussing it, but then imagine within the context of a business day to day and all the additional complexities that can potentially bring. But yeah, that's a whole bunch of stuff about this particular challenge that we've seen and been learning about and talking with people about. So before we move on, again, any questions here? Any feedback from folks? Thoughts?
You hear the big echo in the hall? Nothing yet.
Yeah. All right, great. Is this, not to put you on the spot here, Daniel, but just in terms of what the typical types of things that you guys discuss in your meetings and whatnot. I mean, is this do you think it's resonating with the group or what?
I think we got a comment back. It is so. Yeah, I think it is a reality. Like you noted on your slide and everything you've been talking about. You have the tools that are comfortable, and then basically making the change. So.
Okay, great. The last thing I want to do is just talk about a bunch of stuff that people don't care about. Don't want to waste anyone's time. So the next couple challenges here are just they're not, I think, as fundamental, and I don't think they're necessarily as complex as the first two that I put up there. But it is relevant, and I think where the change is being pushed from, very much if it's a top-down change versus if it's bottom-up change. I think either one could work. I've seen sort of both of them in different scenarios, but the consideration is that it's a very different strategy in terms of if you're the EVP of lean and operational excellence for a huge company, that's you're going to need to have a different strategy and set of strategies in terms of driving the organizational change, as opposed to if you're a project manager and you're saying, oh great, I heard I've been hearing about this lean thing, and seems like a good thing, could potentially make us more profitable, or we could be delivering a better product, or whatever the case is, right? And trying to sort of grow that from the ground up and get things moving that way. And it's not so much that one's better than the other, a very different set of circumstances. And I think that, at least based on the conversations we've had, it really matters, right? I think it's just a ignore it at your peril kind of thing. If you don't particularly consider, okay, where are we pushing, where are we driving this change from, you're going to wind up in a spot where you've got a I guess dissonance or disconnect between the group of people that you're trying to get to adopt these principles and the methods that you're using to do that. So I think it's just, that's a little bit more of it's not a challenge directly so much as the different circumstances that each of these, they create a different set of challenges or needs or what have you. So that's sort of really all that I wanted to touch on there. And then this is kind of the other one, right? It is that what are the different types of applications for these for lean and lean methodologies. And one of the interesting things that we've seen is that it kind of falls into two groups, right? You've got sort of lean, managing a project in a lean fashion versus making the organization as a whole more lean. And what's really interesting is that the two different approaches, they've got a very different set of challenges, I think. And they've got a very different approach that I've seen people taking with them, but there's a lot of overlap in the effect that each one causes, right? So if you think about a construction project and you're thinking, in terms of, okay, and we'll just take a sort of a typical example that we run into, right? Someone's implementing the last planner methodology on their their project. They've got, in the trailer for their planning meetings, their whether it's weekly planning meetings, make ready planning meetings, or just the daily stand up huddle with the various trades and foremen there. If you think about that, and you've got the sort of the classic whiteboard and stickies, and people are committing to their tasks and discussing it, and it's that's going well, and then you've got sort of that is the epicenter of how you're sort of bringing lean into the organization. It's within the context of a project, and that sort of ripples out, right? And so you've got how do you go from, okay, we've got the plan in the trailer, to disseminating that out to whether it's management or different stakeholders within the company, back in the office, or to clients. And then, once you sort of get to that spot, and you've got information that's now back either in the office or with clients, that information is going to get used in a whole bunch of different ways, right? I mean, you might have project managers who are managing the relationship with a particular client for that project, or you've got that information being used internally, or potentially it's being used in marketing efforts, or winning new business or repeat business, in terms of, hey, here are the various things that we're doing to improve our services. And but once you get the information back there, right, it's how are you handling it, and if you're managing things in a quote unquote lean way on the project, does it make sense to translate that, if you will, into the different sort of, I guess, quote unquote standard ways that you're managing information back in the office, and vice versa, right? If you've got, we talk to plenty of people who are approaching it from the other end, if you will, and saying, okay, well, great. We have got a whole bunch of pre-construction processes that happen, more in the office, and we want to manage the process of getting all our permits in place, and having making sure that when marketing goes out and talks to folks, or whatever the case may be, that they've got the latest and greatest data, or that they're managing their efforts in a lean way, so that we're ultimately, right, if you can make the one aspect of the company more lean, right, and they produce less waste with their efforts from an organizational perspective, that's going to save on your bottom line, and either you're increasing your margins on in terms of what you need to do for your project. So there's lots of sort of crossover that we see in terms of various applications of lean principles and methodologies. And it's I think the interesting thing is that it sort of bleeds over, right? In that not just in a what happens with the information, but from an actual how do we drive this? We've seen people saying, well, okay, maybe it makes sense to start over here with our pre-construction group, and bring some lean principles in here, versus, and then maybe after we see that this is working well, we'll convince some other people that maybe they should try it, and it can just sort of ripple out both in the effect that it has, as well as driving the different applications within the business. So that's less of a challenge. It's kind of like the other one. It's less of a direct challenge, and more it's the set of circumstances that are then going to give rise to different hurdles depending on the exact situation. Any questions so far, or thoughts? I know I keep asking. I'm sure I sound like a broken record, but I always like to check.
No, there was last go around. There was some just some general comments, and I think the best one was there's a lot to take on, nothing to ask, but listening to the facts. So at least they're engaged in listening.
Great. Yeah. And it's, I mean, this is me trying to, distill months worth of conversations, into, I guess, the key themes that I keep seeing, again and again. So yeah, it's absolutely, there's a lot to digest. And, if there's questions after the fact, or, if anyone, days or weeks later, whatever it might be, thinks of something, or wants to reach out, or, have a conversation, I'm more than willing, to continue this conversation offline. I find this stuff, personally very interesting, just from a, how do you solve the puzzle of, creating this type of organizational change. So by all means, this doesn't have to necessarily be the end of the conversation.
Sounds good.
Great. So the last challenge that we typically see, is the diversity has to do with the diversity of project teams. And this is, so the sort of the classic, example that we keep bumping into is, we'll talk to someone, they've implemented some degree of lean, methodologies, within the company. And what happens is, and so internally, Newforma has a sort of a yardstick, that we, generally, measure, conversations by, right? And it's kind of the various stages of a lean journey. And so someone who's level 0 is someone who has, never before heard of lean, and it's lean, what's that, right? And level, 2 or level 3 is, oh yeah, we started doing some stuff, we're finding that it works, we're, trying to become more lean, and so on and so forth. And then, get all the way up to, level 4. And those are the folks, that, they will say, oh, we don't do lean, we are lean, right? We work with a company, that, they'll have a meeting, and then they'll sit down after that meeting to say, okay, how could we have made that meeting more effective? And that's how far to the right of the spectrum they are in terms of their particular adoption of lean. But so it's what we have sort of interestingly found is that, we'll have a conversation start, and whether that's us having reached out to this particular person, or they're reaching out to us, and in one way, shape, or form, that conversation will sort of say, oh yeah, we describe ourselves as level 2, right? We're using, we've implemented some degree of lean, we'd like to do more, that sort of general sense. And that's a conversation with one particular person who, regardless of their role within the organization, they're, sort of spearheading that lean initiative, right? And then we get into, more in-depth conversation. Maybe more people are on the call. It's maybe it's the immediate team that this person works with, and all of a sudden we go from a solid, oh yeah, we're definitively here on sort of the spectrum of lean adoption, and that becomes much more indistinct. And some people on the call will say, well, we've only just started, and we're doing well with this piece, but we're struggling with that piece. And then, right, and so the whether there's individuals within the team, and they might be very new to lean versus the initial person we spoke to has been doing lean related things for 5 or 10 years. There's a whole range of experience level and comfort level with lean principles, methodologies, all that. And then you take that sort of immediate team, right? And, we expand the conversation to, not that we're getting, an entire company on the phone, but just the context of, how is this particular company adopting lean? And, come to find out that, all right, well, within the context of the entire company, maybe this particular group is actually on the forefront of adopting some sort of lean principles, right? And where we originally sort of, had a conversation that seemed like, oh, okay, this particular company is solidly, level 2 in terms of their adoption. Now we're finding out that, well, they're anywhere between, level 0 and level 2 in terms of their adoption of lean. And that, greatly depends on who you talk to, where they are in the organization, what their role is, and all that. And that is, I think, it can be an incredibly complex situation to be dealing with, right? And how do you take that, right, and say, okay, well, we've got this whole comfort level thing that we were talking about earlier in terms of how people are used to managing and organizing their information and plans, and then you sort of add that layer of complexity of, sure, you might be trying to convince people to go from one thing to another, but then, what are the organizational comfort levels, and what are the individual comfort levels, and with the type of thing that you're trying to change, and how do those interact and affect each other and play out. And that is, I think, the least. It's the fuzziest challenge that we encounter, for sure. It's not particularly something that we've seen people really address from the get-go. It sort of, arises at some point. People kind of go, these folks over here are doing really well with it. These folks over there haven't really touched it. What's going on here? I think in every situation where this has sort of gotten discussed, that's how it's kind of arisen. So it's another one of those, here's the challenge, but it's definitely the fuzziest, but I think very, very important, because again, it affects in so many ways how you're going to approach driving these types of changes. So that's the challenges, and I think that we're right on time here. I've got about 12 minutes left. So what we're going to talk about now are the different approaches that we've seen people take and apply to these challenges. And so what I want to say up front here is that all these different approaches absolutely overlap with each other. They're distinctly different approaches, at least in my mind. But in terms of the challenges that they address or interact with, there's a lot of overlap there. And in terms of the effects and sort of how you would implement some of these, there's definitely, from the implementation standpoint, definitely a lot of overlap as well. So we'll run through these, that none of them are particularly, complex. So we'll run through these in a few minutes here, and then we'll have sort of 5 minutes at the end for wrap up and any additional questions that might have come up. So the first approach that I want to talk about is the idea of crawl, walk, run. And this is especially applicable to the software aspect of the conversation. And way back at the beginning, we had sort of had that point about software can't fix people problems. And oftentimes what we run into are, people are saying, okay, we're implementing these lean principles, and they're new, right? This is organizationally, this is a new thing that we're doing. regardless of whether the person driving the change has 5, 10, 20 years of lean experience. Organizationally, it's new, and we're having some problems. And so we'd like to put in some software, have that, see if we can't fix some of these problems. And it's very much in some ways, it can be a putting the cart before the horse situation. And what I mean is that not only are sometimes people, trying to solve people problems with software, but there's, I think, an issue where you'll get into a situation potentially where you've not quite bitten off more than you can chew, but because the implementation of these types of things can be so new organizationally, there hasn't been necessarily, at least in the conversations we've had with people, sometimes we see a situation where there hasn't been enough time for the organization to figure out, okay, is this piece of the process that we're trying to implement, is it difficult because it's fundamentally something that software could improve? Or is it difficult because it's a new process, or maybe we've implemented it in a way that it wasn't exactly designed for, or we didn't do potentially a good job of implementing it, or there's a whole host of issues there. But the idea is that if you bite off too much, right? And one of the whole sort of driving principles behind or when you're is breaking work down into smaller chunks. And I think that applies very much in how you adopt it as well. Crawling, taking those baby steps and saying, okay, we want to put in this new thing. What's our current state? What's our desired state from a process and a systems perspective? And then, sort of very carefully tweaking kind of one piece at a time and figuring out, okay, we've made this, rather than changing 100 things at once, and then when something doesn't go right, saying, I don't know why, maybe a software will fix it. An approach where you say, okay, let's make this small change here. Okay, that's working well. Let's make this additional change. That didn't work so well. Is that because we made a weird change, or they interacted weirdly, and just taking that time to figure out, okay, what's going on here, right? And it's I think very much taking that sort of systematic, well thought out, prior, beforehand approach, as opposed to just, wholesale saying, right, we're going to do this lean thing. We've decided to go with last planner, and wham, bam, thank you, ma'am. We put this whole new thing in place. So the idea of, crawl, walk, run very much is, I think, one that people have seen working well. And that sort of ties right into the idea of, do you make the cultural change first and then put in software, or are there situations where a back and forth might help? And what we've seen is that it's a little bit of both at the same time, depending on the scale and the scope of the change that you're trying to put in. So, from a big picture perspective, you definitely want to get, I think, you want to have that cultural shift and then, put software on top of that. From a day-to-day, targeted application, it actually, I think, works better the other way. And I'm not saying that this is the perfect answer or anything, just that this is sort of what I've seen here and there. If you can, show one of the things that our software, to give a concrete example, one of the things our software does is that it's cloud-based, and so if I make a change to a particular project, the next time somebody logs in and looks at that project, they're going to see the most up-to-date status of all the different activities. And so from a reporting perspective, right, that's a situation where you can say, oh, okay, so we're trying to adopt this lean set of processes, but reporting and disseminating the plan to non-co-located stakeholders is a time-consuming and inefficient process. And that's almost directly antithetical to the whole idea of, reducing waste. And so that's a situation where absolutely, if applying a software there can make adopting the process, it removes a barrier to adopting the process. So there's definitely a back and forth here between the two, right? Because saying big picture, get culture then software versus, application, applying software very targeted ways and very specifically at the micro level, that can definitely be tricky to figure out. And I'm not saying I'm sitting here with all the answers, just that different approaches for different situations is, I guess, the message I'm going with here. In a similar sense, right? There's you've got lean, right? And saying we're adopting lean is that can be a loaded term, right? And that has a whole lot of connotations that people. When we talk to people and we say it's under the lean umbrella, almost inevitably that people react with a gut emotional sort of visceral that seems like a tricky thing, as opposed to if we're talking with people about visual planning and just understanding the status of work from a visual perspective as opposed to trying to digest a spreadsheet. That doesn't seem particularly difficult to wrap your head around, or like it would present a whole lot of organizational challenges necessarily. And it's when we're talking about it, right, in the context of our software and is it something you'd want to buy, it's the same thing, right? But the context and that you have the conversation in can absolutely change how the conversation is received and affected. And so I think from an organizational perspective, having different approaches to getting different people on board with the adoption of these new methodologies and systems and practices, whether or not software is involved, is, I think that's a lesson we've learned, but I think it's more generally applicable to this whole idea. And then we sort of covered it a little bit earlier, but just having that, rather than saying we're adopting lean wholesale across the company and trying to drive through this huge change, right? Saying, okay, there's potentially different applications of, maybe you call it lean because you're talking in the context of last planner when you're in the context of a construction project or on site. And then maybe you call it visual planning when you're talking about it in the context of knowledge work back in the office and all that sort of stuff. And it's just, again, it's just different applications of the same ideas in some sense, as you're adopting these things. But it's all context dependent. So that's what I've got for you folks. I think we got 2 minutes left scheduled. Like I said before, if you've got questions, absolutely, I'm happy to answer them now. If you've got questions later, happy to connect with you. I'll make sure to pass along my contact info to Daniel, and he can get that out to you folks. And by all means, if you want to continue the conversation or chat about any of this stuff, like I said before, I find it interesting. And I'm always interested in learning about, what other people are doing and the challenges they're facing or any of that stuff. So whatever floats your boat. But yeah, at this point, I know we're right up on the hour, but any questions?
We got to thank you.
You're very welcome.
I think the earlier comment said it true. There's a lot to digest, and I think the approach is right. And I'll definitely get your contact information out to the attendees today. And anyone, if you have any questions at the end, as you know, when we wrap this up and exit the webinar, we do have that survey. So if you need your learning unit, please mark it a yes and include your AA number if you need it to be registered. And there's also, I believe, slot for general comments, and please feel free to ask anything there. And with that, it's 10 o'clock or 10 o'clock Pacific time. So we will hand this off and hope everyone has a good week. And thank you, Alex. Appreciate the presentation.
Yeah, you're very welcome. Have a great day, everyone.